I'm joined today by Spencer Chumbley, who is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and filmmaker. His work has been featured by many media outlets, including Vice. Today, we're going to talk about a pipeline known as Line 5, which is actually the subject of a new documentary produced by Motherboard and Vice. Talk to us about Line 5. Let's start there. What is it? Where is it? And importantly, how much fresh water is potentially endangered by this pipeline?
So Line 5 is a section of Enbridge's Lakehead system, which is a network of pipelines that runs through the Midwest region. To kind of take you back, Enbridge is a Canadian oil company. They're a multinational oil company that operates worldwide, but most specifically in Canada and the United States. So the Lakehead system is a pipeline system built. Most of it was built in the 1950s. That kind of spiderwebs its way through the Great Lakes region, mostly in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. So Line 5 is a section of this pipeline that's kind of come under scrutiny in the last couple of years because it actually runs underneath the Great Lakes. The section that it runs underneath the Great Lakes of is technically known as the Straits of Mackinac, which is the small portion between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. It's about 5 miles wide and actually extremely, extremely deep. So Line 5 is that specific section running from Superior, Wisconsin, all the way down into kind of the lower peninsula of Michigan, and then crossing this large water boundary at the Straits of Mackinac.
What in particular about Line 5 is leading some to call it a sort of ticking time bomb? What differentiates it from any other pipeline?
I mean, there isn't so much that actually differentiates it from except this one specific characteristic that is it's old and it's beneath the Great Lakes. You look countrywide in the United States, a lot of the infrastructure that was built, pipeline infrastructure that was built in the United States was built in the 1950s and 60s. And so what you have here is kind of a perfect coalescence of problems or issues that focus on Line 5 or that's brought Line 5 into the attention is because not only was it built in 1953, making it over 60 years old, it's actually in an extremely sensitive freshwater environment in the Great Lakes. And so people kind of, once they found out about it, and the reason that they found out about Line 5 was that the fact that Enbridge had a major oil spill in 2010 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was the largest inland oil spill in American history and leaked over 1 million gallons into the Kalamazoo River. So while the rest of the world was pretty much fixated on the BP Deepwater Horizon spill, Enbridge kind of snuck underneath the radar with this large inland oil spill. And so afterwards, activists and concerned environmentalists started to kind of look what else is in our state, what else is in Michigan. And when they started tracing the lines back up north through Kalamazoo, they saw this pipelines. And so what they discovered is a 60-year-old pipeline, over 200 feet underwater, and run by one of the companies with the worst environmental record, and was responsible for the largest inland oil spill in American history.
Yeah, and I want to get to the sort of background on Enbridge that you're alluding to, but before we do that, talk a little bit about in a number of write-ups about Line 5, I've seen the statistic presented that this pipeline, if it were to rupture or spill, could threaten 20% of the world's fresh surface water. Where does that number come from? Is that an accurate number? Help us to understand that.
Well, so the idea is that it's a twin pipeline. So Line 5 is a 30-inch pipeline that runs along from Superior, Wisconsin through northern Wisconsin, and then kind of starts to skim the coast of Lake Michigan until it crosses in the Straits of Mackinac. And then at that point, it splits into two 20-inch pipelines. Each of these pipelines is that Enbridge has newly installed two automatic shutoff valves on either sides of the straits. But if one of those pipelines was still to rupture, each of those pipelines underneath the straits carries 1.5 million gallons of oil. So in a worst case scenario, not if one of them broke, you're looking at a 1.5 million gallon oil release. And then if two of them broke, you're looking at a 3 million gallon oil release.
When Enbridge has been asked about this and more generally about the safety of what they're doing, they say our pipelines are safe. Then you look at the sort of record on oil spills for Enbridge, and you see that between 1999 and 2000, there have been more than 800 spills. At face value, you say, that's insane. 800 spills. Now, could the devil's advocate argument be, yeah, but if you consider the amount spilled relative to the amount that has been moved through these pipelines, it's actually a really pretty good record. It's just that when you have such a big network and you're transporting so much oil, you're going to spill some. How can we make sense of either of those arguments when a sort of layman hears 800 spills?
I mean, it really depends on what you value. I've kind of made the argument in the film that we're speaking about that, or I asked the question, is this the cost of doing business for pipeline companies?
Sure.
Enbridge is going to make the assurance that no oil spill is acceptable to them. I would argue that for any oil company or oil transport company, this is factored in. They carry insurance policies to offset the cost of such disasters. And if you look at the history of the operation of this industry over the last 50 years, these pipelines leak. I mean, there's no question about it. The converse answer to your question from I think from an activist standpoint is that no oil release in the Great Lakes is acceptable. When you're talking about the economic value of one of the largest freshwater systems in the world, if not the largest, what's at stake if any leak actually occurs in the Great Lakes? And that's really what this comes down to is, yes, it seems that oil companies, yeah, maybe they do if it's a 99% success rate. But what if that 1% is actually quite large and it's affecting an extremely sensitive freshwater ecosystem? I mean, especially in the state that the United States is in at the moment, where you've got wildfires and extreme drought on the West Coast. What does it say about the Midwest that there's not enough defense or care being given to one of our greatest freshwater resources in the United States?
Oftentimes, when we talk about infrastructure in the U.S., people are thinking of bridges and tunnels and roads, etc. But here we're really talking about energy infrastructure. And I'm curious what you know about what the law says about the upkeep and renovation and modernization of this type of pipeline.
Basically, I mean, the portion of the federal government that regulates pipelines is called PHMSA, or the Pipelines and Hazardous Material Safety Agency. There are no risk parameters set by the federal agency to decide when these pipelines need to be replaced, what level of risk they can be operated at, et cetera. I mean, in an emergency, what to do. So realistically, you have a federal agency that does pretty much nothing. And even a couple years ago, its head at the time made the comment that the regulatory process is basically dying. I mean, that's a direct quote. So you have a federal agency that has really no regulatory teeth. It's left up to the individual pipeline operators to make this decision of what's acceptable. And that's really the problem is this kind of this lack of transparency. And that's what people have been fighting for in Michigan is that, we have a right to know. Our economy and our livelihoods are extremely tied up into the health of these lakes. They are freshwater oceans. And I think that's what people on the coast of the United States don't understand. And we need to be able to set these thresholds of risk, not the company, and especially not a company that is responsible for the largest inland oil spill in American history. And to talk a little bit more about that specific oil spill, there were known anomalies in line 6B. There were known fractures and things that should have been inspected and should have been rectified. But they kept kind of operating the pipeline at normal capacity and not addressing them. And the federal government was nowhere to be found.
It seems like another one of these cases where those who are against regulation in a number of industries will take an incident that happens and point to the regulating agency and say, see, regulation didn't work. And it's such a counterproductive argument because in so many of these cases, what we find out is that the problem was not that the agency exists, but wasn't able to regulate properly. It's that it doesn't actually have the power to do enough regulation. In other words, they argue that this is evidence that for needing less regulation, when the reality is it's evidence that we need more.
I mean, I think it's not a dichotomy of a kind of an esoteric conversation of the regulation of industry or the regulation of commerce in America. It's the idea that there is no safety management of this type of infrastructure that's adequate to prevent massive environmental destruction.
We've been speaking with Spencer Chumbley. He's a Washington, D.C. based journalist and filmmaker. Thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Thanks for having me on.